I'm using a white paper plate and I am painting a first layer of acrylic straight onto a primed board, and it's about 8 by 10 inches. So I'm using a large flat brush just to apply the paint. This colour is the main sort of colour that I can see in the photograph. And just to say a big thank you to Chris McMurdo for allowing us to use her beautiful autumn photograph. So I'm going to allow the painting to dry. Once the painting is dry, I am mixing up a little bit of ultramarine with a pinch of water into the yellow there, and I'm using a round brush. And I'm just separating the sort of tree, the large tree on the left, and the sky, and then painting in the horizon line. And now I'm just sort of painting or drawing in with the brush some of the trees, adding a little bit more ultramarine. I'm just sort of painting in the sort of trees here in the foreground. So the drawing initially is really nice and simple. I'm mixing up ultramarine and white titanium, and I'm going to paint the sky. And this is kind of the first sort of underpainting. So I've got my yellow background, which is going to tie everything together and make it easier not to paint on a white background. Now I'm just going to paint in the local colour of everything. So just painting further down now, further than the actual sort of trees, because I'm going to paint those trees wet into wet. So I'm mixing up ultramarine with cadmium yellow pale. So it's about 70% ultramarine and 30% cadmium yellow pale with a pinch of white titanium. So I'm painting here using a sort of 1/2 inch flat brush, wet into wet. And I'm sort of varying the heights of the trees. I'm not worrying too much about painting detail. These are going to be the very sort of distant, misty trees. I'm blending there with my fingertips. Now, just to say, this is a demonstration that I did with my acrylic students. So they are gathered around me as I'm painting this lovely autumn scene. So I'm kind of responding to some questions as well. And just to say, they really enjoyed this class. And I must say, so did I. It was lovely teaching it. So this is Indian yellow. You can use cadmium yellow mixed with a pinch of alizarin crimson. And I'm just sort of painting in the little house and some of the warmer trees there as well, using a 1/2 inch flat brush, really loading my brush with acrylics, no water, and just painting some of the sort of foliage on the tree there on the left hand side. It's all really super loose. It's for you just to block colour and shape in. So I'm mixing up ultramarine with a pinch of yellow and a pinch of alizarin crimson. Well, it's a little bit more of a pinch, but actually worked out quite well. So it is about 50-50 alizarin crimson, ultramarine with a pinch of yellow. And I'm just blending there with my fingertips there just to blend everything together. It looks quite autumnal already. This is a bit of the cadmium yellow pale, wet on dry with a large flat 1 inch brush. And I'm mixing a little bit of yellow into that alizarin and the ultramarine. Well, quite a lot of yellow actually. So it's a sort of a yellow green here right at the bottom there. Big brush strokes. Adding a little bit more sort of mid green there just at the bottom, blending. I'm going to allow the acrylic painting to dry. For this next stage, I'm just going to repeat what I've just done, but with a little bit more finesse. So I'm mixing up the ultramarine with white paint. And I'm painting wet on dry, large brush strokes at the top of the sky using my 1 inch flat synthetic brush. A little bit more white here to make the sky slightly lighter. And I'm painting just below there, wet on dry. And because it'll get slightly lighter, it will look sort of further away. Plus, I want some contrast of light against a mid-tone with those sort of semi-distant trees there. So I'm working my way down there, and I'm actually painting over that tree, mostly on the left, because I want to sort of paint the sky behind. I can always paint some more foliage on top. It makes it easier. So as you can see, I'm varying my brush strokes, sort of, you can see that my wrist sort of turning this way and that, so you don't get sort of a painting by numbers feel or a household painting look going back and forth. This way it's lively, it's full of life, lovely painterly brush strokes there. If your painting is drying out too quickly, just get a little spritzer bottle and spritz it sparingly, and it'll just keep the paint sort of moving, especially if you want to blend it, and it's really good for skies. You don't want to over spritz because it'll water down the acrylics too much. So what I'm doing now is I'm mixing up those distant tree colours again, using the ultramarine and cadmium yellow. And I'm using a sort of 3/4 flat brush. And I'm going to sort of have a sort of a dancing brush, really. Sort of, you want the tree sort of tops to be sort of pointy and sort of smaller. And as you go down towards the sort of middle and bottom of trees, just get gradually larger to create the look of those sort of fir trees in the distance. And that's what I'm doing there. And you can vary your colours. So I'm adding a little bit more sort of ultramarine there with a pinch of yellow, just to make a slightly darker sort of blue-green colour. And it just doesn't make the painting look too flat. Adding a little bit more yellow now. And a touch of white actually, and I'm just going to apply that again with this flat brush in between there. So again, a slightly different shade, and it makes the painting look more interesting, but it also creates depth as well. So I'm just making sure the tops of those trees are like almost like little triangles, broken triangles, and then just adding a little bit more blue. And as you can see, working side to side, sort of nice sort of flowing brush strokes, sort of horizontal brush strokes. So it's quite an impressionistic style. And I'm keeping everything loose. You don't want to bring these trees forward. You want to keep them light with less detail so they don't look too interesting. Otherwise, your painting will look flat if you give them more detail, etc., make them brighter colours. Because when you come to paint your sort of autumn trees in the sort of middle and foreground, it's sort of going to have a little bit of competition. So think of these as extras in a film or a theatre show where you want them to kind of be in the background, so that you want your stars to come forward. So I'm just adding a little bit more ultramarine there to the bottom, just to make it a little bit darker, so it sort of gets hidden away. And I'm now painting in the tree trunks and a couple of branches just in straight lines. And then what I'll do is I'll just sort of blend and soften with my fingertips. I'm using a rigger to do this. I'm mixing up ultramarine and alizarin crimson with Mars brown. You can use Payne's grey if you want to, mix with burnt umber or sienna. So it's up to you, just as long as it's a dark, interesting colour. And the rigger allows me to paint long, thin lines, which is what I'm doing here. And they don't have to be like the photograph. I'm using lots of artistic license, and I'm also blending the top and bottom of those lines so they sort of sink into the tree. So it gives the impression of the sort of tree trunks there. So adding a little bit more of that dark, and this time I'm turning my painting sideways, because sometimes it makes it easier to paint sort of straightish lines. So see what works for you. So I'm just carefully painting these lines. Anything you don't like, just smudge them away afterwards. So don't worry about wobbly lines. Just experiment. So I'm going to dry the painting once more. And what I'm doing now is I'm going to paint the autumn trees, those beautiful sort of autumn colours there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to paint wet on dry with a small sort of flat brush here. And I'm almost scrubbing the brush onto the wooden panel. And that creates almost like a dry brush effect. You're not piling the paint on here. You're just sort of scrubbing the side of the brush against whatever surface you're using, and less paint goes down, and you get this lovely textured effect. So I've started actually light to dark. I've used a lot of watercolours over the years, and I thought it'd be quite nice to work light to dark here. So this is the lightest colour, the sort of orangey colour. I'm going to start introducing some red orange. I'm working my way down to the sort of horizon line there, really loading my brush and creating that sort of texture with the belly of the brush there. Have fun with it, creating textures, and you might want to practice on a sort of sheet of paper before you do this. You feel more confident before you go in. But remember, you can paint straight over the top with acrylics. So this is a little bit of that red orange there, and I'm stippling it in to create some lovely sort of textures. I'm also rolling my brush, twiddling it in my fingertips there to create some really nice textures as well. So do have a little experiment. I'm adding more cadmium yellow pale here, just mixing up a little bit more colour, and then just sort of painting with the belly of the brush there, again to create more textures, building up the foliage on this tree. I've added some more red here and alizarin crimson, and I've got a lovely sort of almost shadow colour, and I'm just going to paint underneath some of the foliage here, damp into damp, or you could do this wet on dry. It doesn't matter if your painting has dried here. And again, I'm stippling in some of this sort of stronger colour here to create the look of shadows underneath the foliage. Loading the brush again. This time I'm using the rigger brush, because sometimes it allows me to sort of allow the brush to dance around to create different marks, etc., especially for smaller leaves. So I'm mixing up a little bit more of a lovely orange colour there, and I'm going to paint some of the trees here in the middle ground. Wet on dry, again using the belly of my brush. Going into some of the alizarin crimson, the red and yellow there. I'm just going to add some of that colour to vary the colours here. Wet on dry, and I'm using a small, flat, long brush, long haired brush. It's not a round brush, it's a flat brush. And I'm just adding a little bit more colour here, building up the detail, painting down to the horizon line. And I'm adding a little bit to the left here and to the top of the tree. So I have mixed up some cadmium yellow with a pinch of ultramarine. I'm painting the grasses here, wet on dry, with a 1-inch flat brush. And I'm just sort of scrubbing that on there, using a little bit of that alizarin with the red and the yellow with a bit of ultramarine. Everything's thrown in here. And I'm just sort of painting this very sort of earthy green in the foreground there, wet on dry with a large flat brush. And I'm mixing up a little bit of Mars brown with some red with the yellow. So it's really earthy and warm, adding a touch of ultramarine there just to make it a tad darker. And I'm painting this wet into wet with the 1-inch brush, just sort of blending that with my brush there. And as you saw there, my fingertips. So I am adding a little bit more orange here. And that's the red, yellow with a little bit of alizarin, and I'm painting the little house again, wet on dry with a sort of 1/4-inch flat brush. And it's a really simple shape. I'm not even going to sort of paint the little house that's in the photograph. I'm going to simplify it even more. And what I'm doing now is I've mixed up ultramarine with the alizarin crimson, and I'm going to mix up some Mars brown in there as well. And this is going to be for the tree trunks, especially for the main tree there on the left. So make sure you mix plenty of paint. And now I'm using my rigger to paint the tree, wet on dry. Take your time. You don't even have to paint the size of the branches and tree trunks. Just paint sort of thin lines, and you can go back to them and make them thicker. Just make sure that you join up each of the branches or tree trunks. So here I'm doing sort of the main tree trunk, and what I'm doing is I'm leaving gaps for the foliage, so the tree trunk looks like it's going in and out of the foliage there, and it sort of creates sort of depth. And as I go towards the bottom, I'm making the tree trunk wider, but remember you can widen it as well. Do what makes you feel confident. So again, I'm going back in there and I'm just painting the bottom of the tree trunk there and just making it a little bit wider now as I work my way up, just loading the brush with fresh paint. If you find the paint is too thick, because it's quite tricky in acrylics to paint thin lines, just add a pinch of water and hopefully it'll flow better for you. If you notice, I make sure that I sort of splay out the bottom of the tree there so it looks like it's growing out of the ground. If you keep it straight, it will look almost like a telegraph pole. So I'm just concentrating on that area there, still using the rigger, painting upside down. I find sometimes it's easier, especially if you're painting long, sort of thin branches. Remember, take your time, just mark in the branches. You can always go back to them. Acrylic is very forgiving. So I'm just outlining the little house here using white, wet on dry, using my rigger, or you can use a small round brush. So I'm painting it pretty much like it is at the front in the photograph. So just using the sort of tip of the brush there to paint these windows in, wet on dry. And I will fill some dark in there later using ultramarine mixed with burnt sienna. And I'll paint the rooftop a little bit darker with the ultramarine and burnt sienna as well. Remember, just keep it really simple. I've actually made it less complicated, just adding a little bit of green sort of foliage there in front of the building to push it back, and the grasses. So I've not kind of gone completely with the photograph there. I wanted to make it look more natural. I'm just brushing there some cadmium yellow pale along that sort of horizon line there and smudging with my fingertips as well, just to make everything look super sort of natural and loose, and adding a little bit of orange foliage there around the house and the trees there, just kind of push it back to make it look more realistic really. Adding a little bit more sort of orange there to the left with my dancing brush, still using that rigger just to create all this sort of light sort of details on the foliage there, using the red and yellow mix there. And I'm just adding some yellows and oranges, etc. for the leaves in the foreground there on the grasses and under the tree. And mixing up a sort of a more of a neutral colour here for a few darker leaves there, using the ultramarine with the yellow and crimson, with my rigger brush wet on dry, and adding a few more marks just underneath this tree here and around the little building as well. And you can see there I've darkened the roof as well. So I've watered down the yellow slightly, and I'm spattering just on the horizon there over the tree and a little bit over the house as well, to sort of tuck it away to make it look more natural. And you can also spatter over your tree and in the foreground where the leaves are. I've swapped to a small round brush because I found it easier to spatter than the rigger brush, which sort of got a bit flicky. And here is the finished painting. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial, building up dark to light to create this beautiful autumnal scene. If you would like to support the content that I create here on YouTube, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below. Just click Patreon. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. Happy painting. Bye for now.